other state oversight that you must do as approval authorities is to review the lovely annual reports that you get. So there are federal requirements for our annual report content, and this is the list. It's enlisted in 403.12I. So, you know, federal requirement, federally they're required to submit a list of IUs, names, addresses, any deletions or additions that were added to the previous list, classifications of each IU and the applicable limits, a list of MT CIUs, that middle tier CIUs, if the PODW is implementing that classification, as well as non-significant categorical industrial users. Those are the federal requirements. There's more, you know, they have to summarize each IU's compliance status, summary of the POTW's compliance activities, includes the frequency of compliance sampling, the frequency of compliance inspections, and any changes that the pretreatment program implemented during that previous year, and any other, little catch-all, any other information requested by the state. So as an approval authority, you can always request more information to be submitted in that annual report. Now, the EPA Region 9 has published a little memo of additional reporting requirements that EPA Region 9 would like to see the state collect in their annual reports, and here's a list of that. They want to know the compliance status, the POD's compliance status with their NPDES permit requirements. Are they in compliance with those? Summary of the PODW's effluent monitoring, some sludge monitoring, any non-fire pollutants that the PODW might be monitoring for. A discussion of upsets and pass-throughs. A summary of TTO monitoring, that's supposed to be status instead of statute. Sorry, status for applicable IUs. A list of standards that were violated by the IUs during the reporting period. And those are additional EPA Region 9 requirements. There's some more. List of SIUs and S&C, description of pollution prevention plans, and so forth. Now, and then, of course, all these, you can read all these. It's all in there. What's interesting was I did an exercise and read a lot of permits last week from the different regional boards just to see what the annual reports, content, the requirement, how they differ from regional board to regional board, and they do differ quite a bit, even though there's a state template. Some regional boards may require more than others. For example, one regional board actually has a cover page requirement, and then they have requirements to include definitions that are in their ordinance. And there was one regional board that wants a table outlining local limits and stuff like that. So whatever you have written in your permit, whatever requirement is in your NPDES permit that you draft or you write, you need to evaluate those annual reports to make sure all those things, all those little boxes are checked and have been submitted to you. And an interesting thing I noticed is, I'm going to go kind of weird order. I'll ask everyone's opinion for their opinion of the definition of consistent compliance. So is your definition, if you agree with this definition, raise your hand. Consistent compliance means you're always in compliance, you don't have any violations whatsoever. If that's your definition of consistent compliance, please raise your hand. Consistent compliance.
What are our other choices?
Other choices. Okay, choice A or choice B would be you're in violation every now and then, but none of the violations exceed the effluent limit by more than 2, like 2 times more than the effluent limit. You could be in violation once every 6 months, but that violation does not exceed the limit by 2 times that limit. So consistent compliance, 100%, never having any violations, or every now and then.
Well, consistent compliance sounds like you're consistent with how you are. You're either always in compliance or always out of compliance, but you're never.
Right, and that's what I would think so too. But when I was reviewing an annual report, I won't tell you who, but it's in California. It looked like the majority of their SIEs were compliance, and then they had a column of inconsistent compliance, and there were a couple, not very many. So during our PCA, I asked them, can you give me a number of all your IUs that are in 100% compliance? There were a lot of IUs, and I feel like counting them off if they're in the report. They're like, well, I can't tell you that. I can't tell you who's been in 100% compliance. So then I asked, well, what's the difference between 100% compliance and consistent compliance? And this is when they said, well, just because they're consistent doesn't mean they didn't have one effluent violation during the reporting period. If they had one violation and that violation didn't exceed twice the limit, we consider that consistent compliance. That didn't make any sense to me. Does that make any sense to you? And so then I asked them, well, where'd you get this definition of consistent compliance? They said it's in their NPDES permit, but they couldn't show me. They couldn't tell me. I'm like, show me, let's pull out her right now, pull it out and see. It wasn't there. So just because you get a report, this is when, this is why you have to follow up with inspections, because it didn't make any sense. But then I asked another POTW within the same region, and their consistent compliance definitions was what I believe. They're in compliance, there's no violations. So what they were reporting to the state, it's not appropriate. The program looks like it's much better run than it really is, because their definition of consistent compliance isn't really consistent compliance. The joys of reviewing annual reports. So I like the fact that some of the regional boards are requiring them to include definitions, because if you include a definition, you can look up what the POTW is classifying as consistent compliance. But that's not, it's not a requirement, that's just one regional board decided to do that. But at a minimum, these reports have to contain all of the NPDES permit requirements and the federal requirements as listed. So why are we reviewing annual reports? Well, you get to review to see a snapshot whether or not they're complying with their program implementation procedures. Are they inspecting at the frequency they said they would do during their program submission? The little Bible, the pre-tripper Bible. Are they conducting adequate numbers of compliance samples? Are their SIUs conducting adequate frequency for self-monitoring? And are they applying their definition of SNC? And sometimes there's typos, or sometimes you'll see, oh, wait a minute, the city didn't take a compliance sample at ABC company. What happened? So that would be something you would follow up on during an inspection or audit. It could have just been a typo, or it could have been they just didn't do it. They really didn't do it. And they didn't tell you they didn't do it. They just left it in that table, hoping you wouldn't see it. So review the annual reports. Annual reports also, is a way to evaluate the effectiveness of a POTW's enforcement action. If you see an IU that has repeated violations over and over each quarter, maybe the city's enforcement response plan needs to be updated, because if you escalate enforcement and up their fines, most IUs will clean up their act and stop violating their effluent limit. But if they keep on doing that, maybe there's a bigger issue at hand. Maybe you need to start looking at their enforcement response plan. These are little triggers for you. Were there a significant number of repeat violations? Does the city have an ERP? Some cities, even though they were required back in the early 90s to have ERPs, some cities haven't adopted one yet. So maybe they're not even taking any enforcement. Little red flags. Even though it says they're required to do something, sometimes POTWs don't do it. Other reasons for reviewing annual reports, you can identify focus areas for upcoming PCAs and PCIs. If their annual report says, oh, we've lost half of our significant industrial user base, that should be a red flag. Did they really lose it, or they inappropriately reclassify them as non-significant because they didn't want to do the work of conducting inspections and samples? Even though they're supposed to notify you of those modifications, sometimes notifications are loosey-goosey. They don't realize that they're supposed to notify you. This is why it's important to review annual reports from year to year, make sure there's no huge differences. Were there any outstanding issues that they were supposed to correct from the previous year? They should, follow up on that in their annual report. Significant program changes. We mentioned before, they had 3 FTEs in this year, or upcoming year. Their budget has been cut, and now they're only operating with 1 FTE. Is that going to be a resource issue that you're going to find during the PCA? Should that be a focus area for your upcoming inspections and audits? So you finished your review, you checked off all the check boxes. Now what do you do? So did they report everything you're supposed to? They're supposed to. If not, do you give them a call, or do you write them a warning notice, whatever? So make sure they have reported everything to you, and that they report it correctly. If you require them to submit quarterly reports, they submit quarterly reports. There is one regional board within this area that requires quarterly reports. And there's others that require annual and semi-annual, so that they submit their reports on time. Did they report all the program modifications, and was there any errors? Just like you look through all of that. That was quick. Any questions? It's important to review the annual report. You find a lot of stuff. I mean, I can't remember exactly how I figured this one out, but there was a questionable inspection frequency on a table for a POTW. It just looked off. And I went and asked the POTW during our inspection, what does this number mean? And they were not able to produce any documented inspections. I don't know what triggered me to flag it, but they've been falsifying the frequency of inspections. I can't remember what triggered it, but it was like, this doesn't make any sense. So, you know, you can find things in an annual, you trust but verify. So if something looks fishy, it's probably not right.